Hi, good afternoon. In this video, I would like to talk about a few pointers to do that will enable you to do stretching more efficiently. The first tip is to do bilateral stretching if possible, meaning that you stretch both sides at once when that's appropriate. And so examples of that would be calf stretching. So for example, I can do a calf stretch that does both calves at once, and therefore I get done in half the time. The other example would be with quad stretching. If I do a prone quad stretch, I don't need to just grab one foot, I can grab the other foot as well, and then get done in half the time. So that's the first tip, is to do both sides at once when that's possible. Now, when wouldn't you do that? The first example of when you wouldn't do that is when you're coming back from an injury, or if you want to focus in particular on the one body area that might be giving you trouble. Maybe it's pain, maybe it's excessive stiffness. And so in that case, it might make more sense to just focus on the one side, because you're going to be doing that in a different range and with a different intensity, possibly with a different hold. So that's one example of when you wouldn't do bilateral stretching. The other example would be certain amounts of rotation or instances of where you use rotation as an adjunct to the main stretch. And sometimes it's not possible to do that. So for example, with the quad stretch, if I'm down here and I want to stretch my left quad and I do this, I might want to add a rotational component, and so I couldn't do that both at once on each side. I can do external rotation at the same time, but I couldn't do internal rotation. So if I want to get that internal rotation stretch, I would need to do that just one side at a time. The other example, the final example of when you wouldn't do bilateral stretching at once is with a shoulder stretch. For example, you can do a doorway stretch that gets both sides of the pec at the same time. And this is frequently taught this way. You get done in half the time as if you did it on the same side. However, I think it's a more effective stretch to block the front of the shoulder, to isolate the stretch in the pec. And so I would have to come over to the one side of the doorway to do that and put my shoulder right against the door frame and block it like this. Once I do that, I can't obviously do the same thing on the other side at the same time. So that's an example of when we couldn't do that. But just keep that in mind with your stretching. When possible, do it bilaterally, both sides at once. But then just keep in mind not to limit yourself, because the second tip is to add rotation to the main direction of stretch, especially if you're encountering a sticking point. So the example, and this especially works well for the ball and socket joints, for the hip and for the shoulder. And so an example of this would be for the quad stretch. If I'm stretching my quad in the prone position and I get to a point where it is stiff and it just doesn't seem to get there, my one metric of how flexible my quads are is that my heel touches my butt by the end of the stretch. And if I'm having difficulty getting there, I can add a rotational component, internal rotation of the hip here, external rotation of the hip there, and that can sometimes get past the sticking point. The other way to introduce rotation, particularly with the quad stretch, is to do that just in a fairly relaxed state with internal and external rotation done at the same time on each side as an adjunct to the main stretch of the quads. So that's the rotational part. But you can really do rotation, and I talk about this in my other stretching videos. You can add rotation to most of the stretches that you do. The third and final tip I'd like to talk about today is breathing. Pay attention to your breathing. When you breathe, when you inspire or breathe in very deeply, you should use your diaphragm, so that means your belly goes out, and then also at the final point of the breathing, the rib cage expands, and then when you exhale, the reverse happens. But pay attention to that while you're holding the stretch, because there are several very good neurological phenomena that occur when you fully expand your lungs during a stretch. And you'll get some muscles will tighten, some muscles will relax during that cycle. And that can be a very good way to add to the benefit of the stretch.